Imagine a piece of ground so small you could walk its length in 20 minutes, 2 kilometers long, in places less than 500 meters deep, a muddy shelf of riverbank, pinned between a wide gray river and an enemy who held the high ground on 3 sides. Now imagine that on this scrap of earth, smaller than many city parks, 250,000 men became casualties. That when a soldier crossed the water to reach it, his life expectancy could be measured not in weeks, not in days, but in hours. The average was 52. After that, he was dead or he was wounded. There was very rarely a third option. The Russians gave it a strange, almost gentle name. They called it the Nevsky Pyatachok, the Neva 5 kopeck coin. A Pyatachok is a tiny coin, the kind you could lose in your palm. It was soldiers' slang for a patch of ground, so small it was barely worth a name at all. But for nearly 2 years, this coin-sized strip on the bank of the Neva was the most fought over, most blood-soaked piece of the entire siege of Leningrad. The grass would not grow here for 10 years after the guns went silent. This is the story of why men kept crossing that river, and why so few of them ever came back. To understand the Pyatachok, you have to understand the city behind it. In the autumn of 1941, the German army stood at the gates of Leningrad, the second city of the Soviet Union, the cradle of the revolution, home to nearly 3 million people. On the 7th of September, German motorized troops took the town of Schlisselburg, on the southern shore of Lake Ladoga. With that single move, the last road and rail link into Leningrad was severed. The noose was tied. What followed would become one of the longest and deadliest sieges in human history. Nearly 900 days, and more than 1 million dead. Most of them civilians, most of them starved. But the noose was not as tight as it looked. Between the besieged city and the rest of the Soviet Union lay a narrow neck of German-held land, a bottleneck only 12 kilometers wide, with the Neva River running through it. If the Red Army could punch across that river and hold a foothold on the far bank, they might tear the bottleneck open and break the siege from the outside. On the map, it was the most obvious place to attack, and the Germans knew it too. Every gun they could spare was trained on the water. On the night of the 19th of September, 1941, a small group of Soviet soldiers under a captain named Vasily Dubik slipped down to the water's edge. They had no landing craft. They crossed in fishing boats, in rowboats, on rafts lashed together by hand, paddling through the dark toward the German-held bank. Somehow, they made it. They scrambled up the far shore and dug in. By morning, they held a tiny bridgehead, a few hundred meters of mud on the wrong side of the river. They could not make it bigger, but they would not give it up. The coin had been minted. Now it had to be defended. To reinforce the bridgehead, men had to cross the Neva, and the Neva became a killing ground all its own. The river here was wide and open, fully visible to German observers on the heights. Every boat that pushed off from the eastern bank rode into a curtain of fire. Mortars walked across the water. Artillery shells threw up columns of spray. Snipers picked at the rowers. Soldiers described the surface of the river as boiling, not with heat, but with the endless impact of steel. Many men never reached the far shore at all. They died in the boats or in the water, and the current carried them away. The soldiers learned to be clever, because cleverness was the only thing that kept them alive a little longer. A smaller river, the Dubrovka, fed into the Neva near the crossing point. Men would launch their boats up the Dubrovka and let it carry them down into the main stream, shortening the time they spent exposed on the open water, the deadliest stretch, the part the German gunners had ranged to the meter. Minutes mattered. Seconds mattered. Every yard of river you didn't have to row in the open was a yard that might let you live to reach the bank. Reaching the bridgehead was not safety. It was only the beginning. The Pyatachok was a strip of churned black earth, with the Germans dug in on the high ground above it, and the river at the soldiers' backs. There was nowhere to retreat to. Men carved dugouts and shelters and command posts into the steep bank, burrows in the soil where the wounded were treated, and the living tried to sleep. And the bombardment never stopped. By some accounts, the Germans threw as many as 50,000 shells onto this tiny coin of land every single day. One survivor remembered it simply. The earth was black, and the snow was black too. Among the men who crossed in the winter of 1941 was a volunteer named Yuri Poresh. He fought from a foxhole with two comrades, Misha, a truck driver from Leningrad, and Oleg, a schoolteacher. For days, a German sniper had been hunting them. On the dawn of the 9th day, a mortar shell burst beside their shelter. A splinter killed Misha instantly. Poresh was hit in the head and the ankle, and Oleg, dazed, rose up for just a moment, and the sniper who had waited all week finally took him. His body slid down into the foxhole to Poresh's feet. Poresh was now alone, wounded, deafened, bleeding. He closed his friend's eyes. He covered them. He bandaged his own head, though he could not even pull the boot from his wounded foot. And then he did the only thing he could do. He kept firing his rifle into the dark, not because he could see a target, but in his own words, just to let everyone know the foxhole wasn't empty, so that the line would hold, so that no one would know that on this patch of the Pyatachok there was now only one man left, and he could barely stand. When relief finally came, Poresh crawled to the river along the remnants of a narrow-gauge railway, using the wreckage to hide from the flares. He reached a dugout in the bank, where doctors and nurses cleaned his wounds and gave him half a cup of vodka to stop the shaking. Then they sent him down to wait for a boat. Moments later, a heavy shell struck the bank above that dugout. The earth came down. The doctors and the nurses who had just saved him were buried where they stood. The riverbank itself had become a grave. The Pyatachok did not kill only the famous or the heroic. It swallowed ordinary men by the tens of thousands. One of them was a factory worker named Vladimir Spiridonovich Putin, the father of a boy not yet born, who would one day lead Russia. In November of 1941, he was defending this riverbank when a German soldier rose up and threw a grenade. It landed near him. It killed the man beside him and tore his own legs apart with shrapnel. He lay by the Neva for hours, bleeding into the frozen mud, one casualty among hundreds of thousands. He would almost certainly have died there, except that at a primitive field hospital, an old neighbor recognized him on a stretcher. The man hoisted him onto his shoulders and carried him across the frozen river to a hospital on the far bank. He survived. He lived the rest of his life with fragments of German steel in his leg that the surgeons could never fully remove, and a limp that ached whenever the weather turned cold. A small, permanent piece of the Pyatachok he carried for the next 40 years. He was one of the lucky ones. He came home. By April 1942, the Bridgehead was held by the 330th Rifle Regiment, around 1,400 men, dug into the same cursed strip of bank. And then the river itself turned against them. The spring thaw came. The ice on the Neva began to crack and break apart. Within days, huge floes were grinding down the current, and the crossing became impossible. No boats could get through, no reinforcements, no ammunition, no way out. The 1,400 men of the 330th were now cut off on the German-held bank, alone, and the Germans, who called the Bridgehead the festering sore in the side of their army, chose that exact moment to cut it out. The German assault opened on the 24th of April. Their infantry drove a wedge into the northern positions, slicing off the narrow panhandle along the bank. 2 days later, they split the defenders in two and began grinding inward toward the river. A relief battalion of 400 men tried to cross the ice-choked water and lost more than half its strength to artillery before it even reached the shore. By the evening of the 28th, the last pockets of the 330th were surrounded with their backs to the Neva. Out of ammunition, the final defenders fought with what they had left, entrenching shovels, bayonets, and rocks. They held until a last volley of grenades silenced them. When it was over, the 330th Rifle Regiment had ceased to exist. The Germans took 117 prisoners. Nearly everyone else was dead. Only a handful of men escaped, among them a major named Alexander Sokolov, who threw himself into the freezing, ice-choked Neva and swam for the far bank. swam away from a battle that had killed almost everyone he knew. The Nevsky Pyatachok had fallen. The coin had been spent. You might think that would be the end of it. It was not. 5 months later, in September 1942, the Red Army crossed the Neva again, to the very same strip of bank. They retook the Pyatachok, and the dying began all over again, on exactly the same ground, in exactly the same way. Because the strategic truth had not changed, this coin-sized scrap of Riverbank was still the shortest path to breaking the siege, and so it had to be paid for twice. In January 1943, the Soviets finally launched Operation Iskra, Spark. The 67th Army of the Leningrad Front and the 2nd Shock Army of the Volkhov Front drove toward each other through the bottleneck, and at last broke through. After nearly a year and a half, the siege of Leningrad was cracked open. But even in victory, the cost stayed cruel. The corridor they opened was only 10 to 12 kilometers wide, so narrow that every train and every truck carrying food into the city still ran under the muzzles of German guns. The soldiers gave it a name. They called it the Corridor of Death. By the time the fighting in this sector finally ebbed in May 1943, the numbers had become almost unimaginable. In this stretch of the front, Red Army casualties are estimated at around 260,000. The Germans lost perhaps 160,000, and it had all been spent on a piece of ground you could cross on foot in a quarter of an hour. Not a clever battle, not a war of maneuver, just attrition, flesh against steel, day after day, on the smallest, deadliest patch of ground of the entire war. When the war ended, the Pyatachok was a wasteland. The soil had been so saturated with iron and fire that, for nearly 10 years, the grass would not grow on it at all. It was a field of craters, unexploded shells, twisted metal, and the unburied dead. In the decades since, the trees that finally returned have grown around the shrapnel and the shell casings, swallowing the war into their trunks. And every spring, when the ground softens, searchers still come. It began with Leningrad schoolchildren, who came on summer trips to look for the bones of the fallen. It grew into something larger. Volunteer search detachments, the Poiskoviki, who comb this ground year after year, lifting remains from the earth and giving them, at last, a proper burial. They are still finding them. Every year, new names, or no names at all, are recovered from the soil of the Pyatachok and laid to rest. The ground here does not forget. It keeps handing the dead back to the living, one fragment at a time. Today, a granite memorial stands on the bank, where so many crossed and so few came back. On it are words written by the poet Robert Rojdestvensky, spoken in the voice of the men who lie beneath the soil. "You who are alive," it reads, "know that from this land we did not wish to leave, and we never left. We fought to the bitter end by the dark Neva. We have perished so that you may live." The Nevsky Pyatachok has no famous victory attached to it, no daring escape, no clever plan that turned the war. It is remembered for something harder to look at, the sheer, grinding cost of holding a line that had to be held. 250,000 men fed into a strip of riverbank smaller than a village, so that a starving city behind them might live. They were truck drivers and school teachers and factory workers, ordinary men who crossed a dark river knowing the odds, and crossed it anyway. The coin was small, the price was not, and the ground by the Neva is still, quietly, paying it back.